Well, once again, welcome, and thank you so much for being here this morning as we start this brand new sermon series called The Power of a Whisper. Now, this series was originally put together by someone named Bill Hybels, who is the founding pastor of Willow Creek Church. He wrote a book by that title, The Power of a Whisper. He preached on it at his church, and there's a small group series. There's all sorts of resources tied to this book, The Power of a Whisper. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to go through this series, but we're really just going to scratch the surface on this topic. And so if you'd like to delve more into the topic of listening for God's whispers, I highly recommend you get yourself a copy of this book. Wonderful book, and really speaks practically to this issue. And as I said, this book and this series is all about prayer, and maybe more specifically, we could say this series is about making room and making time for God in our lives, not just time where we speak our prayer requests, but time to actually listen for God's voice in our day-to-day lives, to listen for the voice of God, which can seem like this amazing, supernatural, strange, uncommon kind of a phenomenon. But when we look at it, it's actually more common than you may think to hear from God. I have a friend, a Christian friend, and he is always talking about how God speaks to him. And he's not boasting, he's not bragging about it. It comes up in conversation. He'll say, "Oh yeah, I was in the middle of the night. God woke me up and He told me this, that, or the other. Or I was driving my car and all of a sudden God said to do this, and so I responded." Or I was sitting there in a counseling meeting and God whispered in my ear that I should say something, so I said something. He's always talking about hearing from God. Now, do you have anybody like that in your life who's saying, "Oh, God told me this and God told me that and God speaks to me all the time"? When you have people like that in your life, well, let me just speak personally about it. When I have someone like that in my life, and when I hear from somebody that's saying they constantly hear from God, a few things happen inside of me, okay? Number one is I get suspicious. I say, "Are you really hearing from God? Is that really God's voice in your life?" Because sometimes it can be tough to separate, what's my inner thoughts, what's my inner monologue, and what's God's voice, or, to separate the two of those things can be a little bit tricky. So I wonder, are you really hearing from God? But then there are some other things that happen when I hear from someone who's saying, I hear from God all the time, and I start to get a little bit jealous even, if I could use that word. Like, well, why doesn't God, if God's talking to you all the time, it's like you're having conversations every day, you're hearing from Him, He's telling you stuff, why doesn't God talk to me that often? And then thirdly and lastly, and maybe this is like the biggest emotional response I have, is I feel a little bit inadequate as a Christian. I feel like, what, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe there's something, I feel like I'm not hearing from God as often as other people. Maybe there's something, maybe I'm not spiritual enough. Maybe I'm just not good enough to hear from God on a regular basis. And my biggest concern about doing a series like this on listening for God and hearing His voice in our lives is that I don't want any of us to feel inadequate. I don't want any of us to feel like we're not good enough to hear from God. Because the fact is, God can and does speak to so many different people in so many different ways. And all of you in this room, all of us, we are all capable of hearing from God. In fact, it's very likely, and you may be sitting there thinking, well, I've never heard God's voice, and I've never, had one of those experiences like the guys in the Old Testament. There was Moses, and God appeared at a burning bush, and that was really incredible. I've never experienced anything like that. Well, even if you've never experienced anything like that, it's very likely that you have already heard from God. Maybe you didn't recognize His voice. Maybe you didn't, at the time you just kind of felt compelled to do something. But it's very likely that you have already heard the voice of God in your lives, in your life. And so that's what I want to do in this series, is to show you that you can hear from God, and you probably already have, even if you may not realize it. You've already heard from God. That's very, very likely. Now, just a few moments ago, Brendy read this passage for us, a passage from 1 Kings. And in this passage, we meet somebody named Elijah, and we see some incredible things that go on, and we see him hearing from God. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background information about Elijah so all this makes sense. Elijah was a prophet, and he lived in the Old Testament times. And a prophet, that's a word we hear and we think, whoa, what an incredible thing, a prophet. Specifically, what a prophet is someone who hears from God and then delivers the message to other people. So God speaks to the prophet, and then the prophet has the responsibility, or burden, you could call it, of having to go and share God's message with the select group of people, whoever God says. God says, I want you to go to these people and tell them that message. That's the job of a prophet. And so Elijah was a prophet. And he's one of these examples that we see in the Bible of someone who hears from God in miraculous ways. In truly phenomenal, supernatural ways, Elijah hears from God. And there are many examples of people who hear from God in these amazing, remarkable ways. God wakes people up from dreams, and God, like we mentioned earlier, God appeared to Moses in the form of a burning bush for some reason. How strange was that? But when I was working with Kelby this past week and we were talking about this series and really thinking about how to deliver this message, these messages, Kelby brought up a great point. It's that when you look at the Bible covers a span of thousands of years. And if you really think, how many examples are there of people who hear from God in these miraculous ways? It's really, not that many from a larger perspective. And so God does speak to people in these big ways, in these miraculous ways, in these big signs, and these, the voice of God booms like thunder. That can happen. That has happened. But there are plenty of other examples of God speaking in different ways, in subtle ways, in whispers. And so even this prophet Elijah, who heard from God in big ways, in thunderous ways, in audible voices, here's an example of when he hears God, and not a big supernatural event, but he hears God whisper. And you can see, and if you were listening to Brindy read, we have these amazing things that happen all around Elijah, and Elijah was there listening. He was listening. He was actively listening for the voice of God. He was waiting to hear from God. And so he's there waiting. As he's there waiting, there's these amazing things that happen. There was a great and powerful wind, and it was so powerful that it tore the mountains apart. You're thinking, surely this is God. Here's God about to speak. But the Lord God, he was not in that powerful wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. There's just a few verses that record all these big things, and we can just kind of breeze through them. But these are big-time things. You had a fierce wind that's destroying mountains. Then you had the whole earth quaking beneath his feet. He's thinking, whoa, okay, I'm listening for God. This has to be God. But God wasn't in that earthquake. The voice of the Lord was not in that earthquake. And then there came a fire, and I don't even know, what do you mean there came a fire? Can you give me some more details on this Bible? Because what do you mean? Just a fire broke out somewhere? There was a great fire? And Elijah's thinking, whoa, look at this. I don't see this kind of thing every day. There's God. I'm waiting for you, God. Speak to me. But the voice of God wasn't in that great fire. And then after the fire came a gentle whisper. And that was God. God was speaking in that gentle whisper. Now, the reason that this book is called The Power of the Whisper, it's really based on this passage. And something that, as you're reading the book that Bill Hybels wrote, you'll realize that he defines these whispers not just as these tiny audible voices that we may hear from God, but as nudges that we get in our spirit. A little prompting that you may feel in your heart. And so if the word whisper, you're thinking, well, what does it actually mean? What we're talking about are these little indications from God. Maybe it's an audible voice. Maybe it's a big, miraculous, supernatural thing. Maybe it's a tiny little whisper. Or maybe it's just a little kick in your spirit. A little nudge or a prompting in your heart that God is telling you, you need to do something. That God is telling you, you need to stop doing something. That God is giving you some kind of command or some kind of word, speaking something into your life. My favorite example in the Old Testament of someone who hears from God in this kind of a nudge or a prompting or a whisper is a man named Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was a man who lived back during a time where the nation of Israel was disgraced. They were exiled. The Babylonians had come in and defeated the nation of Israel. They wiped out thousands of people. They took some captive back to Babylon. Then the Persians took over. The Persians overtook the Babylonians, and they set up their rule. And under the Persian rule, some of the Israelites were allowed to go back to their homeland and back to the holy city of Jerusalem. And so some of those Israelites trickled back to the holy city. But Nehemiah was an Israelite, and he was there working for the Persian king, Artaxerxes. And he did not go back initially to his homeland, to his people. But then his brother visits him, and he finds out through his brother that the Israelites are living in disgrace. That those Israelites who trickled back to their homeland, they never bothered to rebuild their city. They never bothered to rebuild the wall around the city. They're living in disgrace. You know, there was a great war that tore through the whole nation, and they never cleaned up after it. And so the remnant, the few that went back home, they were living in disgrace amongst the garbage, amongst the rubble. And the Israelites were supposed to be this great nation. They were supposed to be God's chosen people. And so when Nehemiah finds out about this, he gets a big old kick right in his spirit. And he feels like this is wrong. These are God's people. God chose these people to be a light to the rest of the world. They cannot be living in disgrace like this. And the reason Nehemiah is my favorite example of someone who gets a little prompting or a whisper or a nudge from God is because in the book of Nehemiah, in those first several chapters, when Nehemiah is wrestling with all this, when he hears this bad news, you never read the words, and then God spoke to Nehemiah and said, because Nehemiah doesn't receive a big thunderous voice or a burning bush or booming, lightning or fires or earthquakes. He just receives some kind of strong nudge, some kind of prompting in his heart, in his spirit. And he knows God well enough to know that God does not want his people living in disgrace. And so what does Nehemiah do? He prays about it. He goes before God. Take the time to read the book. It's an amazing book, the book of Nehemiah. It's in your Old Testament. He goes before God. He stops eating. He goes on this fast, and he's just waiting and listening and praying. But again, it's not as if God speaks to him in some supernatural way. It's just through that prayer time, through that fasting time, through that intentional time, that intentional quiet time, that Nehemiah develops this understanding of what God's will is for his life and what he is supposed to do. And so I mentioned Nehemiah because, again, here's this example of someone, it wasn't a big, wasn't a burning bush, wasn't a big thunderous thing. It was just that nudge, strong, powerful kick in the spirit that he knew it had to be from God. It had to be from God. Now, I believe that throughout the course of my life, I have heard whispers from God, that God has knocked me around in the spirit a few times and compelled me to say things, compelled me to do things, urged me in certain ways. And I just wanted to give a recent example just to show you how simple this kind of thing can be. A few weeks ago, my family and I, we tried to make a quick little trip to the shore. And we got the car packed up, and we were pressed for time, and I was taking too long. And I was like, let's just get on the road and let's just get there. And so we're on the way, and the bridge that we usually take, they were doing some construction on the exit, and we missed the exit. And you know what? That kind of stuff really bothers me. It shouldn't. But I think, I'm trying to make good time here. I'm trying to get my family. I'm trying to get in and squeeze in this little vacation. Now I'm going to be delayed by an entire 5 minutes. In the moment, that's how I respond. And so I was annoyed, thinking, this is, oh boy. And I was angry at myself. I'm like, why wasn't I paying better attention? What was I doing? And so we get off at the next exit, and we turn around. Truly, no big deal. But as we're turning around to get back on the highway, we come to a stop sign. And when we're there, we see a woman with a sign. And she said, the sign just said, single mom in need. And so when I saw that sign, I didn't hear an audible voice from God, but my spirit just sank. And in an instant, I felt several things all at once. First off, I felt ashamed of myself for being so annoyed by my diversion there, of our little getting sidetracked. And then I realized, I say this, I preach this to other people, I teach it to other people. God has all these things in his hands. He orchestrates all sorts of details in our lives. And I just felt so strongly in the moment, God saying, this is why I had you take this alternate route. You need to give her something. And it just came over me in a single instant, just this is God. And so we stopped a little too long at the stop sign. We had some cars beeping at us, but I was like, you know what, we're on a mission from God, so you all can wait. So, we quickly handed her something. We said a prayer for her, and we were on our way. And so, how many of us have had experiences similar to that? We've been talking about Kenya for a long time, and I'm on my way to Kenya, next week and all this, that, and the other. And we were able to raise over $4,000 for this mission trip that so many will be going on. And I wonder if maybe some of you here heard from God on that issue. It's one thing for, a pastor or somebody to stand up and say, hey, we need to raise money, bring money in, we got to go to Kenya. But it's another thing to hear from God saying, this is something you need to do. This is a worthy cause. And so I'm not sure, but I believe that some of you heard from God on that issue and gave sacrificially and gave generously so that the people of Kenya could receive clean water. And that's just one, small example. There are probably others, and I'd like you to be thinking about this over the course of this series, the different ways that you have personally heard from God. Maybe you didn't recognize his voice at the time, but if you look back on it, you think, that had to be God steering me in that direction. That had to be God guiding my path. And so I'd like you to think about that and pray on that as we go through this series. Now, here's a little statistic for you that I discovered. There are about 2 billion people on this planet who proclaim to be Christians. 2 billion people who identify with the message of Jesus Christ and who identify themselves as his followers. Can you imagine what it would be like if all 2 billion of us lived our lives with one ear open for God's voice, listening intently as Elijah did, listening like Nehemiah did, listening for his voice in our lives, and then just ready to respond, ready to receive our marching orders, and then ready to march. What would this planet, what would this world be like if all of us Christians, if all 2 billion of us lived that way, listening, ready to go at the command of God? I think our world would be a much different place. And just think about right here where we live. Think about Delaware County. Think about all the Christians, all the people who are in a church service right now, who are sitting listening to some pastor talk right now. What if all of us here lived our lives with that ear open, waiting, not just waiting, but anticipating, expecting God to speak, ready to jump at his command? Can you imagine how different this community would be? The kind of things he would call us to do? Just imagine, this whole county could be transformed if all of us Christians who lived here just lived our lives that way, waiting, expecting, anticipating to hear from God. And let me make this a little bit personal, okay? This is the second time that I've been through this series. We went through it at our last church. And us pastors, before we went through the series at our last church, we were talking about this and why we wanted to do this. So I just want to give you a little bit of behind-the-scenes information here, okay? It would be so much easier for us pastors and preachers if the people who came to hear us speak were really listening for the voice of God in their lives. Because it's one thing to come here and hear from me, or to hear from somebody talk, or hear Kelby talk, or hear some pastor, hear some preacher, but it's another to eliminate the middleman and hear directly from God. And now I realize that can be a little bit dangerous. You can think, is this really God's voice? And there are, pick up the book for yourself. There are different filters. There's ways that you can realize, I'm not sure if this is God's voice or not. There are tests that you can do to determine that. But what a wonderful thing it would be if we all could hear directly from God. You know, part of what Jesus came to accomplish here on the earth was to, in some ways, destroy the priesthood and then recreate a priesthood. And back in the Old Testament times, back with the nation of Israel, they had priests that served as a go-between. So the people would come to the priests, and the priest would talk to God and communicate with God and deliver the message back to the people. The prophets worked the same kind of way. But Jesus came to be our once-and-for-all high priest. And we don't have to go to a middleman. We can go directly before the throne of God. We can go directly to Jesus, and we can hear directly from him. And so let's take this time during this series to think about what our community will be like when we start actively listening for the voice of God in our lives and responding to his whispers.